Hi, welcome back to my channel, and today I want to talk to you about Sherlock Holmes, one of my favourite characters from English fiction, the great detective. And I want to look at some of my favourite versions of Sherlock Holmes on film and television. By no means all, there'll be many favourites that will be missing, but this is my personal choice of my favourite versions of the famous sleuth. So of course we've got to start with Basil Rathbone. Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, what a combination. One of the most stylish, elegant and gentlemanly actors in Hollywood with a tremendous energy about him, pitted with one of the great comic actors in Hollywood at that time, a wonderful comic foil for him. I love these films, they're regularly repeated on TCM, and I go back to them all the time. I even like the ones where, when the 1940s came along and they did all sorts of propaganda films where Sherlock Holmes fights the Nazis. I like those even just as much as the other ones. My favourite film is, of course, their version of Hound of the Baskervilles, directed by Sidney Lanfield, which is such a perfect recreation of that story. It gets the gothic elements, the remote, house on the moors, and the atmosphere of Grimpen Mire. It gets it all done so well, and the convict, signalling to the people in the house. It's such a great story, isn't it, Hound of the Baskervilles? And they do it so well. You could argue that Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes is probably the most simplistic treatment of the character. I mean, Rathbone just sort of throws himself at it and uses his, normal suavity and heroic, style to get him through. But he's such a great actor and he's such a great star that it carries you through and you just immediately like him and believe in him. And you believe in him as being super intelligent. And Bruce is just a wonderful comic foil. And you can tell how much they enjoyed doing it. You can tell how much, for example, Basil Rathbone enjoyed the bit, where Sherlock Holmes dresses up as a beggar in The Hound of the Baskervilles. How much Basil Rathbone enjoyed doing that. And that little piece of comedy between him and Nigel Bruce is so beautifully done. I love these films, and it was a very tough act to follow, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. But in the 60s, our friends Hammer Horror had a go, and they made their own version of Hound of the Baskervilles. And I'll tell you now, I cannot choose between them. Honestly, if someone said which is your favourite, the Basil Rathbone or the Peter Cushing version, I couldn't pick. I love these two films equally. This was directed by Terence Fisher, and it happens to be my favourite Terence Fisher film. Yes, I know people will say Horror of Dracula is his best film. I know, but I love this movie. And again, in its own Hammer style, this time in lurid colour, typical of Terence Fisher, it gets that wonderful gothic feel of the original story so well. Peter Cushing, I think, is a very, very underrated Sherlock Holmes. He is the perfect actor for Sherlock Holmes. Like Basil Rathbone, he's a true English gentleman. But like Basil Rathbone, he has this extraordinary, almost supernatural energy, doesn't he? He attacks everything, Peter Cushing. He's very theatrical, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It actually helps, because Sherlock Holmes is a very theatrical, unreal character. So Peter Cushing's strange bursts of energy, his kind of intensity, actually really contributes. And I think it's one of his best roles. I mean, he's best known as Baron Frankenstein, which he played to perfection, right? But I think he's really good as Sherlock Holmes, very underrated. He later went on to play Sherlock Holmes on television, but I think he's at his best here. Andre Morel, very good character actor, very solid character actor, plays Watson. Christopher Lee is part of the cast. I also like the Naughty Vicar, wonderful British character actor whose name I forget. But this is a great version of Hound of the Baskervilles. I adore it. Now, for the next three films I want to discuss in this video, I'm going to discuss three films that are perhaps not so well known or remembered or thought about when it comes to the Sherlock Holmes mythology. The first is a film that came out in 1965, and it's called A Study in Terror. And it's one of the very first of a complete wave of films that came out, particularly in the 1970s, where Sherlock Holmes takes on Jack the Ripper. Right? You'd think it's an obvious combo. And it started with this film, really. And this is, it's got all the elements. You find out that Jack the Ripper is connected to the aristocracy and all this. It's all there, right? Way before Alan Moore got going with, what is it, From Hell. Way before all that. Now, the film itself, it was directed by a guy called James Hill. It's not the greatest movie. It's nicely cast. You've got Glyn Houston, is that his name? Donald Houston, sorry, as Dr. Watson. You've got a young Babs Windsor, a young Judi Dench, Anthony Quayle, great cast of British character actors. The film itself is straightforward, but the reason I mention it is the person who plays Sherlock Holmes, John Neville, an actor who fascinates me. Back in the 1960s, Neville was one of the leading lights of British theatre. He ran the Nottingham Playhouse, which is where I grew up, and he was noted for his work there. And he was regarded as a great Shakespearean and a great theatre actor, and he's an extraordinary actor. He's very tall, he's very patrician and dominating presence, got a great mellifluous voice, and he's a fantastic mercurial actor with a strange kind of energy about him. But for some reason, Neville's career never settled into stardom. Like Cushing or Basil Rathbone, he never quite made that move. He did a lot of work. He was Baron Munchausen for Terry Gilliam. He did a lot of extraordinary work, but he never quite settled on screen. But in this film, Study in Terror, straightforward film, he is a brilliant Sherlock Holmes. I'm going to gently say that one of the best Sherlock Holmes on screen, and you can see that he was the perfect actor for it. And if the material had been a little bit better and the direction had been a bit better, this could have been the perfect Sherlock Holmes movie. So check it out. It's not a great movie, actually, but his performance is fascinating. The second film I want to talk about is The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this was a Billy Wilder project, and Billy Wilder had designed it to be quite a big project. It was going to be about 2.5 hours long. Unfortunately, it was the victim of cuts. The studio cut it to ribbons. And the sort of episodic nature of the film was ruined a little bit. Episodes were taken out, and it was cut down. It's a rather odd movie, and I'm never quite sure whether I like it or not. I'm fascinated by it, but I don't know whether I like it. It's the first of Wilder's late series of films where his work becomes less cynical and smart and more melancholy and romantic and sad and forlorn. Almost a sense of nostalgia creeps into his movies. And in this movie, there's more of an accent, less on Holmes's brilliance and his intelligence, but his romance with this woman whose husband has gone missing. The movie itself goes off into all sorts of strange areas. It eventually ends up in Loch Ness with a submarine disguised as the Loch Ness Monster. It's very odd. But it's beautifully acted. The actor cast as Sherlock Holmes is Robert Stevens, who was also a great theatre actor of his time. Another actor who never really came across on screen. This is probably his best role on screen, actually. Colin Blakely is nicely cast as Watson. And their acting is terrific. The acting throughout the movie is terrific. I find the film is a bit of a queasy mix of Wilder's previous smart, quick-fire, intelligent, Hollywood filmmaking and this kind of new kind of melancholy strain in his filmmaking, and the two don't quite resolve. But what you get is a really interesting movie with an interesting atmosphere, and it's a very interesting addition to the Sherlock Holmes canon. And then later in the 1970s, we get this film, Murder by Decree. Now, this is another of the films looking at the Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper, and this started a whole series of films throughout the late 70s and early 80s. There's an interesting TV miniseries with Michael Caine playing a detective hunting down Jack the Ripper, and there's this actor played by Armand Assant, I think, who is playing Jekyll and Hyde in the local theatre, and he can change his face on stage and they think he's the murderer. It's worth watching. It's not very good. It's got Jane Seymour in it. It's a bit of fun. But this movie is something different. It was directed by the guy who made Black Christmas, a famous Canadian slasher movie with Margot Kidder. And it actually takes Sherlock Holmes as close as you can get to the horror film, right? There's scenes where Jack the Ripper, who's obviously some kind of doctor to the royal family, this film takes it right to the top, cuts up the women, are actually genuinely horrific and disturbing. I remember first seeing this film when I was a teenager, and it got to me. Like you want a good horror film to get to you. The atmosphere on the London streets is beautifully evoked. It's a very good piece of direction by Bob Clark. Sherlock Holmes is played by Christopher Plummer. Not my favourite Sherlock Holmes. I like Christopher Plummer very much as an actor. He's too much of a romantic lead for me as Sherlock Holmes, and he's very romanticised in this film. But playing Watson is James Mason. One of my favourite actors and one of my favourite performances as Watson. He's so perfect. And the scene where he's chasing a pea round on his plate with a fork is gorgeous. This film has got a fantastic cast: Donald Sutherland, David Hemmings, John Gielgud. If you've never seen it, find it, watch it. It is a brilliant addition to the Sherlock Holmes saga. Now, moving into the 1980s, and there were various TV attempts to resurrect Sherlock Holmes. The first was a bit of a disaster. On BBC, they made a new version of Hound of the Baskervilles with Tom Baker from Doctor Who, and it really is not very good. I'm a huge Tom Baker fan from his years on Doctor Who, but it didn't really work, actually. He wasn't very good as Sherlock Holmes, and it's best forgotten. What's intriguing about that is that a few years earlier in Doctor Who, they did a story called The Talons of Weng Chiang, which I think pound for pound is probably the best Doctor Who story ever made. And in this story, it's obviously a pastiche of Sherlock Holmes, right? And they dressed Tom Baker up in a deerstalker and whatever. And he plays a brilliant Sherlock Holmes. He plays it with immense gravitas and this kind of gallows humour, and with all that sort of energy that you expect from Tom Baker, with that beautiful voice. And you think, this guy's a fantastic Sherlock Holmes. But this is a Doctor Who story. And again, it mashes up all these elements: Fu Manchu, Victorian Music Hall, and Jack the Ripper. Way before Alan Moore, way before Murder by Decree, way before that TV series I mentioned with Michael Caine. Doctor Who got there and did a Sherlock Holmes Jack the Ripper story. If you've never seen it, even if you don't like Doctor Who, check it out. I think you'll be surprised at how good it is and how fun it is. The dialogue is hilarious. It's a little piece of genius, really. But the 1980s really belonged to Jeremy Brett. ITV, just as they would later do with Poirot and David Suchet, they launched into the old Conan Doyle stories and they kind of made them all, right? They did a complete set with Jeremy Brett. Now, we need to talk about Jeremy Brett. Jeremy Brett in his youth was a romantic actor. He was the romantic figure in My Fair Lady. When he came to making Sherlock Holmes in the 80s, he was a very, very, very theatrical actor, very mannered. And his performance as Sherlock Holmes is the most mannered performance you will ever see on a television or cinema screen. And maybe some people will find it off-putting. I think it is electric. I think it is brilliant. And I go back to something that Orson Welles said. Orson Welles said there is no such thing as overacting. There is only acting without truth. And he gave the example of Jimmy Cagney. He said nothing in Jimmy Cagney is naturalistic. Absolutely nothing, right? But you believe every second of it. Every second is true to the character he's playing. I could say the same about Tom Baker in Doctor Who. I could say the same about Peter Falk as Columbo. That this idea of overacting is a mistake. It's, are you being true to the character? That's what's important. And there is not a single moment in Brett's performance when he is not absolutely true to the character of Sherlock Holmes. In some ways, I think he is the definitive Sherlock Holmes. He's the Sherlock Holmes that is closest to the character that you read in the book. And the character that you read in the book, of course, is not a normal, naturalistic, psychological character. He's a theatrical creation. Brett understands that, and he goes for it 100%. And every dramatic beat is done through his choice of line reading and his choice of gesture. It powers the story through. And I think it's an amazing sustained performance. He has two very good actors, David Burke and Edward Hardwicke. Perhaps heretically I prefer Edward Hardwicke, but they're both very good as Watson. The problem with the ITV series is that by doing every single Conan Doyle story, it shows how weak some of the stories were. There are only actually a handful of really good Sherlock Holmes stories. Most of them are fairly straightforward, really. And the ITV series kind of shows that up. But Brett's performance is remarkable. I'm only going to discuss one other version of Sherlock Holmes, and that is the Guy Ritchie version with Robert Downey Jr. The reason I discussed this, I actually worked on this. I did the subtitles for it. And I also worked on the audio description describing it for the blind. And it gives you a different perspective on how films are made, and you see that there is a lot of quality in filmmaking that you don't appreciate as an audience member. But working on it, you actually see that there is some skill and thought gone into it. So believe me, there is some skill and thought went into Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes, more than you probably realised. I just want to mention it because although it's not really my kind of film and I don't really care for it very much, Robert Downey Jr. was a perfect choice. I mean, he's got that mercurial energy, he's got that attack, he's got that strangeness and eccentricity, that sense of you don't know what he's going to do next, and he's a good actor. And he was actually quite well cast. And so, strangely, was Jude Law. I was quietly impressed by how good Jude Law was as Watson, as this foil to Robert Downey Jr. So, whatever flaws Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes might have, I kind of admire their acting and their casting. That was quite a good choice. So there are my choices of the best Sherlock Holmes on TV and screen. But let me know what your choices are. Which ones have I missed out? Which ones would you pick as being really impressive? And let me know what else you think about the Sherlock Holmes films down below. Thanks very much.